So this is a very good indication of my major problem with climate science and the physics of climate change. And this is from an article that was posted on news.climate.columbia.edu. So this is from Columbia University, and this is a couple of climate scientists getting together to answer just kind of some of the basic problems that a lot of people have with climate change and climate science, and trying to address these issues and trying to explain how it all really works and why it's such a huge problem. And this is one of the questions: why does carbon dioxide let heat in but not out? So this is the answer to it, and this is at the core of the problem I have with these arguments. So energy enters our atmosphere as visible light. This is the first mistake, whereas it tries to leave as infrared energy. In other words, energy coming into our planet from the sun arrives as one currency and leaves it in another, says Smerdon. CO2 molecules don't really interact with sunlight's wavelengths. Only after the Earth absorbs sunlight and re-emits the energy as infrared waves can the CO2 and other greenhouse gases absorb the energy. So that, I'm afraid to say, is totally wrong, and that's coming from a climate scientist. And it just goes to show what climate scientists really seem to know about stellar astrophysics and these very, very important topics that play into this whole scientific debate, if you like. So they know nothing about what the sun emits in terms of radiation. They're implying that the sun emits all of its radiation in the visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is totally false. That could not be further from the truth. About 51% of the sun's radiation is emitted as infrared radiation, and the sun emits all ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum as well, from radio waves to gamma rays. It emits the whole gamut of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was believed until the mid-90s, in fact, very, very recently, that the sun emits only visible light. That's what we believed about the sun and its physics. We didn't understand. Well, I think we understood before then that stars in the universe are radio emitters, but in climate science in particular, it seems that they've been hung up on this completely abstractly false notion that the sun emits only as visible light, but it hits the Earth, converts it into infrared, and then the CO2 in the atmosphere traps the infrared. Okay, that's all very well and good, but a lot of the sun's radiation is already coming to us in the infrared. So that there's a reflection there by CO2 that needs to be explained. And yes, the sun does emit in the right wavelengths to be reflected by CO2. It doesn't emit much infrared in those wavelengths, but it's enough, in considering that the CO2 in the atmosphere is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. It's enough to be reflected by the CO2 in the atmosphere, if you see what I mean. So this gets to the nub of the issue, and it's by far, it's so far from being a rebuttal of that quite salient point. Why does CO2 let light into the atmosphere but not leave it? But it really it warrants further investigation in proper science, I think, and it warrants careful examination of how different wavelengths of light entering the atmosphere respond to different chemical constituents of the atmosphere. CO2 being one of them, obviously, nitrous oxide being another, methane being another. Those all reflect infrared light as well. So we need to update our understanding in climate science, and climate science needs to get out of the 1980s, where they believed that only visible light comes from the sun, or that most of the sun's light was from the visible end of the electromagnetic spectrum, which it isn't, and start waking up to the reality that what we know now is the sun emits mostly in the infrared. So there's this correspondence there between infrared light emitted from the sun being reflected by the atmosphere, which is what would happen to infrared light if there's CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. They'd be reflecting that infrared from the sun, which counteracts the greenhouse effect caused by infrared coming from the surface of the planet, re-radiated out into space, reflected down by the CO2. There are two processes going on there, one of which hasn't been acknowledged. That's the greenhouse effect, which is very famous, of course, very well studied. And then there's an inverse greenhouse effect, which is as true by the same physical principles. It must be the truth. It must be as true as the greenhouse effect is. So to counteract the increase in temperatures from infrared emitted from the surface of the planet to CO2 molecules in our atmosphere. There must be this other process that's counteracting it, whereby infrared from the sun is being reflected by CO2 in the atmosphere back out into space. And it's very simple. It's just a little desiccated corner of science that doesn't know that much science, that's labouring under false assumptions, labouring under outdated assumptions, or labouring under outdated knowledge, that it needs updating. It needs bringing into the 21st century with what we know now about solar emissions of light, of energy. It does emit in the infrared. And it's not just as visible light. And Columbia, I'll put a link to the description to the article, you can see it. I've read a number of things about the climate on columbia.edu, and they always make this mistake. They always imply that only visible light comes from the sun, which is not the truth. And this bears repeating, and it bears sharing and liking, god damn it. Fight the algorithm. Fight against this nonsense. Please.